Welcome back to Biology 2225 and our discussion of the respiratory system. In this video, we're going to finish up the respiratory system, chapter 22. We left off at objective number 175, so we've taken a look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, and we know that during a typical systemic circuit, hemoglobin will unload about 22% of the oxygen that it carries, moving from an average of about 100% saturation in the lungs down to about 78% saturation in the tissues. And we've also taken a close look at the various ways in which both oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported in the blood, and how concentration gradients dictate the reactions that push, essentially, or allow movement of these gases in the tissues and in the lungs. We finished off last time saying that hemoglobin and its tendency to bind to oxygen, or in other words, its affinity for oxygen, can vary depending on environmental conditions. And this is a good thing. As we'll see, there are various conditions in the body that will either make hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen more or less, and this will determine exactly how much oxygen is released under certain circumstances. And so, for instance, when we get warmer, tissues might need more oxygen, for instance, to support an increased metabolic rate. When we exercise, tissues might need more oxygen to support, again, that increased metabolic rate. And so oxygen, once again, is a beautifully designed molecule, because its affinity for oxygen will change in appropriate ways to support these altered conditions. So what we see is that essentially there are four main factors that affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, and therefore how much oxygen it will unload to the tissues. We've already seen that the PO2 of the environment affects the hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. That basically was the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. That S-shaped curve showed us that the PO2 on the x-axis affected the percent saturation on the y-axis. And so that's what we mean by ambient PO2 here, just the basic oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. But there are other factors that affect it. The temperature of the body will affect the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. Something called the Bohr Effect is in play. The Bohr Effect essentially describes the effect of carbon dioxide levels and pH. And remember, carbon dioxide levels and pH go together. The Bohr effect talks about relates to the effect of pH and carbon dioxide on the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And then finally, something called biphosphoglycerate. Some books refer to this as diphosphoglycerate. It's a chemical released by erythrocytes, and it also will affect hemoglobin's affinity for oxygen. Excuse me. So how do these factors affect it? Well, again, we've already seen that the PO2 of the environment creates the S-shaped curve that we are familiar with. And so we know that as the PO2 of the environment decreases, the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is reduced, and that's, of course, what causes hemoglobin to release its 22% of oxygen under typical circumstances. The Bohr effect has to do, as I said earlier, with carbon dioxide levels and pH. And essentially what happens is as carbon dioxide levels increase, of course, remember that means you'll get a greater production of carbonic acid, so greater acidic conditions in the plasma. And so pH will decrease. Remember, lower pH means higher acidity. And so generally, as CO2 levels increase and pH decreases, that also is going to tend to reduce the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, and will cause hemoglobin to give up more oxygen. we're going to take a look at how these affect the dissociation curve in just a minute or so, but I want to talk about the effect of all four factors and then see how it affects the curve and talk about why it makes sense that these factors affect hemoglobin in this way. Biphosphoglycerate, again, something produced by erythrocytes, will essentially destabilize hemoglobin and once again reduce its affinity for oxygen and causing more oxygen to be released. And then finally, if I didn't say it already, increases in body temperature will promote or cause hemoglobin to release more of its oxygen, reduce its affinity. Now, the rate at which hemoglobin binds to carbon dioxide is also adjustable, also depends on environmental needs, and the greatest effect is something called the Haldane effect. The Haldane effect is essentially that when levels of oxyhemoglobin are low, relatively speaking, relatively low, which of course is a condition that we find in the tissues, then the blood will be able to transport more carbon dioxide. And this is known as the Haldane effect. And so just when we want the blood to carry more carbon dioxide, when it's in the tissues and levels of oxyhemoglobin are dropping, that's when the blood will bind to more CO2. And essentially, remember what this means is, though oxygen and carbon dioxide don't compete with each other for the same binding site on hemoglobin, they do tend to influence each other. And so the more oxyhemoglobin we have, the less likely we are for it to bind to CO2. And conversely, the more carbaminohemoglobin we have, the less likely we are to bind to oxygen with that hemoglobin. And so there's this slight interplay between the two. And so automatically in the tissues, as we get less and less oxyhemoglobin, we're more and more likely to form carbaminohemoglobin. And again, this is exactly what we want to happen when we're in the tissues. All right, now this all may seem somewhat confusing when we're just looking at words and without any rationale for why these things affect hemoglobin in the way they do. So let's take a look at the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curves and how these factors can affect it. So we'll start with the effect of temperature in objective 178 on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And what we're seeing here is the blue curve represents the typical oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve at normal body temperature, which is about 38 degrees Celsius. And what we can see here is what happens to the curve at different temperatures. We've got a curve when the temperature is warmer than 38 degrees, 43 degrees, and then we've got two curves where the temperature is lower than typical body temperature. And you can clearly see, first of all, that that temperature does influence the shape of the curve, which means it's affecting the behavior of hemoglobin. So let's take a look at the high temperature curve for the moment. What we see is that under high temperature conditions, the curve this red curve is below the blue curve. Now, it depends on your perspective. Everybody has slightly different perspectives. Most people see this curve as being below the blue curve. And so they think of the curve as being shifted downward. But again, it all kind of depends on your perspective. It is possible to look at this curve, this red curve, and see it not as a shift downward, but some people see it as a shift to the right. They call it a right shifted curve instead of a down shifted curve. It really doesn't matter. Either way you describe it is accurate. I personally prefer to think of it as a downshift in the curve, And the reason I prefer to think of it as a downshift is because the decrease, helps me remember something. What it helps me remember is that what's happening here is that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is being decreased. We are decreasing the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, which means hemoglobin is not going to hold on to oxygen as tightly as it normally would. And so we see this essentially throughout the range of PO2s that we find in the body. So if we follow this curve up to, again, typical conditions which exist in the lungs of PO2 around 100, notice that we are not getting a near 100% saturation like we normally would or would want to. We're only getting about just above 90%. Still good, but we're not getting as much saturation in the lungs as we would normally want to. And again, that's because the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen has been reduced. So hemoglobin can't bind to as much oxygen. What this also means is that PO2s typical of the tissues where we want to deliver oxygen, we have again lower percent saturation of oxyhemoglobin, again indicating that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen has been reduced. So whereas typically by the time the blood becomes deoxygenated in the tissue, that's down around 78% saturation under normal conditions, notice under higher temperatures deoxygenated blood coming out of the tissues might have about 64% saturation. And so we've got that from 78% to 64%. We've got an additional 14% of oxygen that's been delivered to the tissues. So with a downshifted curve, because hemoglobin is not binding as strongly to the oxygen that it carries, we actually end up delivering more oxygen to the tissues. Again, and that's represented by this shift from 78% down to around 64% saturation in PO2s typical of the tissues. Is this beneficial? And the answer is absolutely yes. At 43 degrees, you can bet that most of the cells in your body are metabolizing at a higher rate. What might cause 43 degrees? Well, fever is one thing, and of course, with fever, we want to deliver more oxygen to the tissues to promote healing. But most typically, this is going to be higher temperatures associated with exercise. And so as we exercise, we know our body temperature increases despite our efforts to sweat and radiate heat out from the skin. That increase in temperature will have its effect on the hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin will automatically deliver more oxygen to the tissue, say the exercising muscles, than it normally would, which is exactly what we want. Also remember, when we exercise, the PO2 might dip down to maybe somewhere around 30 in the exercising muscle tissue, or even less. And again, notice in all cases, the hemoglobin continues to deliver more oxygen than it normally would. That's shown by this reduced percent of oxyhemoglobin throughout that range. So it's very beneficial for the curve to be shifted down under higher temperature conditions to support higher metabolism. And so one thing we want to remember here is that a downshift in the curve always means that the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is being reduced, and hemoglobin is going to release more of its oxygen under those conditions. Excuse me. I've got allergies today. We see the opposite effect for the lower temperatures, because what do lower temperatures mean? Lower temperatures mean lower metabolic rates, generally speaking, across the board. And if tissues are metabolizing at a slower rate, their need for oxygen is reduced. And so under lower temperature conditions where tissues don't need as much oxygen, we do not need the hemoglobin to release as much oxygen when it passes through the tissues. And so you'll notice under those conditions, under very cold body temperatures, under typical PO2s we have in the tissues, we see that the hemoglobin remains almost at 100% saturation, delivering very little oxygen to the tissues, almost the same as its saturation levels in the lungs itself. So very little oxygen is delivered because the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen is so high under these colder conditions. But of course we can tolerate that because at these cold temperatures, again, the need for oxygen is much reduced. So that's the effect of temperature on hemoglobin and how we would demonstrate it through the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Our next graph shows the relationship between pH and CO2 levels and the hemoglobin molecule. Again, remember this is referred to as the Bohr effect. The Bohr effect. And also remember that pH and pH and carbon dioxide tend to fluctuate together. So once again, in the center we see a blue curve which represents typical pH of the blood of about 7.4. The red curve indicates a reduced pH, which means more acidic conditions, and remember that's associated with increases in carbon dioxide levels. Okay, and the green curve represents higher than normal pHs, and that's of course usually associated with lower than normal CO2 levels. Okay, and just parenthetically, even though well, we'll let that stand for now. We'll just leave it at that. All right, so what's the effect we see? We see that increasing acidic conditions, as conditions become more acidic, often associated with increases in CO2, the curve shifts down. So remember what that means. A downshift in the curve means a destabilization of hemoglobin. It reduces the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, and so hemoglobin is going to release more oxygen than it normally would. Now the effect again up at the lungs, at the PO2s typical of lungs, we see there's not much of a difference, and that's good because under any conditions we want to get the highest oxygenation we can in the lung tissue. So we're still close to 100% or so up here, not quite as good as normal, but almost. But notice again what's happening at levels of the tissues, about PO2s of about 40. At the tissues, again, normally we'd unload about 22% of our oxygen, going down to 78% oxygenation. But when the pH is a little bit lower and CO2 levels are a little bit higher, we get more unloading. We get an increase in the delivery of oxygen, and so we go down to about maybe 66% saturation. And again, this difference represents that extra amount of oxygen that we're delivering to the tissues. Why would we want to deliver more oxygen to the tissues? Well, generally speaking, what do we associate decreases in pH and increases in CO2? What do we associate these conditions with? We associate this once again with exercising muscle tissue. When muscles exercise, of course, they consume more oxygen, produce more CO2, so the CO2 levels are going to go up. That's going to cause pH to drop, and those are conditions that indicate exercise, or at least higher metabolic rates of a tissue. Well, if a tissue has higher metabolic rates, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does it need more or less oxygen? And of course the answer is it needs more oxygen if it's got a higher metabolic rate. And so what do we want to do? We want to deliver more oxygen. So again, the hemoglobin molecule is perfectly suited for its job. Automatically, when conditions indicate that more oxygen is needed, its affinity for oxygen reduces and it delivers more oxygen. We see the opposite effect here when the pH is higher and CO2 levels are low. What this usually means is that tissues are very well oxygenated. There's plenty of blood flow taking away carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide levels are relatively low, resulting in pHs that are a little bit high. And so this tissue is probably well oxygenated and doesn't need a lot of oxygen at the moment. And so what happens? The curve shifts up, and once again we see that the hemoglobin its affinity for oxygen increases, and it ends up not delivering as much oxygen to the tissues. And again, these conditions are constantly fluctuating in the body, in various tissues and through time. So we average a typical pH of around 7.4, but again, there's slight fluctuations up and down, and so the hemoglobin is automatically constantly adjusting around this homeostatic mean of pH 7.4, finely tuning our delivery of oxygen to the tissues. Now, we don't specifically have a figure showing the effects of 2,3-BPG on the curve, so I just want to add that to this curve to show you what the effect of that molecule is. Remember, as we said, 2,3-DPG or BPG is produced by erythrocytes, and it's produced by erythrocytes in response to some specific conditions. And you see these conditions in objective 181. Elevated temperature will increase the release of BPG. Hypoxia, probably the most important stimulus, is hypoxia in tissues, meaning reduced oxygen in levels in tissues and blood will cause erythrocytes to release 2,3-BPG. Thyroxine and growth hormone and testosterone and epinephrine, which are all excitatory hormones in the sense of hormones that stimulate metabolic rates. All those hormones generally increase metabolic rates. They also stimulate erythrocytes to release 2,3-BPG. So what's the common thread with all these things? Elevated temperature, generally, as we saw, means increased oxygen demand by tissues. Hypoxia, well, how do we address hypoxia? We've got to increase oxygen delivery to tissues. Increased metabolic rate caused by these hormones means increased oxygen demand by tissues. So in all cases, the things that cause BPG to be released by the erythrocytes is an increased demand for oxygen. So we can probably put that all together and figure out then what the effect of 2,3-BPG will be. As 2,3-BPG is released, it will affect the hemoglobin by reducing its affinity for hemoglobin. So another thing that's going to cause a downshift in the hemoglobin, oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, is an increase in the release of 2,3-BPG by erythrocytes. Again, because the factors that will cause an increase in BPG all relate to increased oxygen demand. Excuse me, and so we need to shift the curve down. On the other hand, a decrease in 2,3-BPG will have the opposite effect, of course. We don't have as great oxygen demand, so levels of 2,3-BPG fall, and that will tend to cause an increase or an upshift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, causing us to deliver less oxygen. So again, hopefully all these relationships are common sense and can be reasoned out, and their effects on the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve become intuitive. All right, our next objective talks about the Haldane effect, which we briefly mentioned. Remember, the Haldane effect is the ability of the blood to carry more carbon dioxide when levels of oxyhemoglobin are low. And again, we talked about that in the context of how CO2 and O2 affect the behavior of hemoglobin. All right, and so that's all explained again in objective 183. With objective 184, we move on to essentially the final topic of this chapter, which is adjustments to the rate of ventilation based on blood chemistry. And what we see in objective 184 is that the rate and depth of breathing are adjusted to maintain typical levels of pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. Recall also that the kidneys will become involved in the regulation of pH as well, but for minute-to-minute short-term adjustments, we can adjust our ventilation rates to try to maintain homeostatic levels of pH, carbon dioxide, and oxygen. And remember, the homeostatic values for these parameters in the blood are a pH of 7.35 to 7.45, a very narrow, slightly alkaline range, a PCO2 of about 40, and this is oxygenated blood, and a PO2 of 95. So our respiratory rates are adjusted to help maintain these specific numbers. The way we do this is pretty much by having respiratory centers, the respiratory centers in the pons and medulla, receive information from central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. Remember, central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla itself. Peripheral chemoreceptors tend to be located in places like the aortic arch and the carotid artery. Of all the factors that we monitor, the most potent stimulus that affects ventilation rates is pH. Changes in pH have the greatest effect on these chemoreceptors. Then carbon dioxide will affect them as well. And then finally, and perhaps this is surprising, but the least significant factor is oxygen. This has the least effect on these chemoreceptors. So they're primarily monitoring pH. But of course, we've talked repeatedly about how changes in these variables tend to correlate with one another. And so by adjusting pH, we tend to automatically appropriately adjust carbon dioxide and oxygen levels as well because of how they fluctuate together. Okay, so again, as we said, we're primarily monitoring the pH and specifically of the brain. The brain is what the brain gets is probably typical of what other organs in the body are getting. And of course, we talked about how very sensitive brain tissue is to a loss of oxygen or a lack of oxygen. So the brain, it makes sense, it's probably the most important organ to monitor, and as the brain goes, so goes the rest of the body. And again, the most important chemoreceptors in this mechanism are the central chemoreceptors in the medulla that we've talked about before. About 75% of the ventilation response is induced by pH changes in the medulla, in the cerebrospinal fluid of the around the medulla by these central chemoreceptors. All right, so carbon dioxide that's in the blood will diffuse into the out of the capillaries into the cerebrospinal fluid, again, where it, as usual, produces carbonic acid. And so, again, all we have to do is monitor the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid with these central chemoreceptors in the medulla that are bathed in the cerebrospinal fluid. And again, 25% of the response comes from monitoring pH in the peripheral chemoreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid arteries. A couple of, I hope, self-explanatory terms. Acidosis is whenever we have a blood pH lower than 7.35. Alkalosis, of course, would be the opposite, any pH that's higher than 7.45. And associated with acidosis and alkalosis are hypercapnia and hypocapnia. Hypercapnia is a carbon dioxide levels greater than 43. Again, this is assuming we're talking about oxygenated blood now, which is supposed to be, again, at about 40. So any oxygenated blood that has a PCO2 greater than 43, that's known as hypercapnia. And hypercapnia, of course, would be associated with acidosis because, again, increased levels of CO2 lead to greater carbonic acid, which leads to more hydrogen ions, acidosis. And as you can see here, hypercapnia is the most common cause of acidosis. And then hypocapnia would be lower than normal PCO2 levels, partial pressure carbon dioxide levels. Anything less than 37 would be considered hypocapnia, and that tends to be associated with alkalosis. And basically, the way we can become acidotic or alkalotic is if our ventilation rates don't match our metabolic rates. And so if our metabolic rates exceed our ventilation rates, then what's going to happen is carbon dioxide will tend to build up. Right? So tissues begin to metabolize faster, say again for reasons like exercise. Rates of carbon dioxide production go up. If our ventilation rate doesn't change, that means we're going to get an increase in the concentration of CO2 in the tissues because we're not eliminating that CO2 rapidly enough, and that's going to lead to acidosis. Of course, as soon as acidosis begins, we start to get corrective measures. Generally speaking, we begin to hyperventilate. This is why we start breathing faster and heavier shortly following the beginning of exercise, because we sense this initial acidosis that's occurring, leading to hyperventilation. That extra ventilation then helps us get rid of CO2 from the blood quicker, and that reduction in CO2 pushes the reaction again back from bicarbonate to carbonic acid to CO2, which is then released. So essentially, we release more CO2, and that then, of course, ultimately reduces how much hydrogen ions are in the system because we're driving the reaction back this way, and that's going to raise the blood pH back to normal. All right, so simply by reducing carbon dioxide levels in the blood, we're going to get an adjustment that corrects the acidotic condition. Of course, hypoventilation can occur sometimes too if we become alkalotic. It's not quite as common to become alkalotic, but if CO2 levels are particularly low for whatever reason, again, this might be because we've hyperventilated in a condition where we don't need to hyperventilate, and so CO2 levels have dropped. Well, then, of course, that's going to have an effect in the opposite direction, right? If we don't have enough CO2, we simply don't breathe as rapidly. By hypoventilating and not breathing as rapidly, we're not going to release as much CO2 per minute from the blood. This will allow the CO2 to build back up in the blood plasma, and by increasing the CO2, of course, you're going to drive the reaction this way, and that's going to, of course, then increase the hydrogen ion concentration, which will lower the pH and bring us back down to normal pHs. So again, hopefully that's all intuitive how this works. Ketoacidosis is acidosis caused by metabolism rather than ventilation type causes, and it's the result of utilizing too much fat as your energy source instead of carbohydrates, and this results in the production of ketone bodies, which are acidic. This has nothing to do with the ventilation rate, though we can alter our ventilation rate to adjust or try to adapt to ketoacidosis, but this tends to be a chronic issue in certain diseases like diabetes mellitus. So pH, as we said, has the strongest effect on our respiratory rates. CO2 has a less potent effect on these chemoreceptors, and primarily it works through its direct effect on pH. But CO2 itself can also weakly affect the medulla. So again, increases in CO2 generally mean I need to increase my ventilation rates to blow off that excess CO2. And so again, it can, not just through pH, but itself, CO2 levels themselves may directly stimulate peripheral chemoreceptors, not so much the central chemoreceptors, but the peripheral chemoreceptors, and this will trigger increases in ventilation as well, just as we would expect. And then finally, for this chapter, we said that increases in levels of oxygen really don't affect ventilation rates too much. They have a very little effect, but under chronic conditions like chronic hypoxemia, where we have oxygen levels less than 60 for long periods of time, then those kinds of extreme conditions can affect ventilation, right? And so for chronically hypoxic, of course, that's going to lead to hyperventilation in an effort to take in more oxygen through increased elevation rates. This is known as hypoxic drive, where chronic, again, hypoxia leads to hyperventilation. This can happen in various pulmonary diseases like emphysema or pneumonia. It can also happen sometimes in very, very high elevations. So we don't experience too much here in Albuquerque, but if you were to try to climb Mount Everest, for instance, without any oxygen, you would begin to experience chronic hypoxemia as you got higher and higher, just because of a loss of pressure, air pressure, and that would then result in hyperventilation. Okay, so that's it for this chapter 22. We're only 36 minutes in, so there will be a second video for today where we will start the next chapter on our syllabus. So hopefully I'll see you in a few minutes to begin a new chapter.